That was an intro film by Nordic Art Talks, a series of Council of Ministers on addressing the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. My name is Tominga O'Donnell, and I am the moderator of this seminar today, entitled Art as a Catalyst for Change by Malmö Art Museum, in collaboration with Expo Chicago and Nordic Art Talks, to whom I extend my gratitude for this invitation. So you can see from the slideshow that I am based at Munch in Oslo, this new Munch museum, which will open to the public this autumn. Next. And we will be delighted to welcome audiences in October, November this autumn. Next, please. I've prepared a list for this building, and you'll see why I address these aspects of the building at the end of the seminar, when we leave you with a list of concrete steps that art institutions can take, put together by the Mustarinda organization. So very swiftly, Munch is built using low carbon concrete and recycled steel. It's a so-called passive building, so that it conforms to standards of energy consumption, which is reduced with the assistance of passive measures, such as additional heat recovery, well-insulated windows and insulation, and the wavy aluminium panels that screen sunlight effectively and also reflect and refract excessive temperature fluctuations. The building is connected to a district heating system and also to a seawater cooling plant. It also features an energy control system that optimizes energy consumption, and the building has no visitor or staff car park spaces, but is connected to local transport hub Oslo Central Station and has a number of bicycle parking spaces. So if we can go to the next slide. Part of this reason I'm here is because I originally commissioned a work on display at Malmö Konstmuseum in the exhibition Sustainable Societies for the Future, which this seminar is part of. And that is Toril Johansen and Marilyn Dijkman's Reclaiming Vision, which was originally commissioned for Munch Museum on the Move in 2018, and took a view of the brackish water where the Aker River, you can see it there in the image, meets the Oslo Fjord through a light microscope where the creatures that we don't usually see starred. And if you go to the next slide, and this is something you can also see in Malmö, these are glass sculptures that function as microscopes with water samples from the same brackish water. So this is what you can see in Malmö in the exhibition, which finishes on the 23rd of May. So you have another 4 days to experience it. But back to today's seminar, Art as a Catalyst for Change. And we can close the slideshow now. This accompanies an earlier symposium, Museums as a Catalyst for Change. So the perspective shifts slightly from the museum to the practitioners. And I'm delighted that we have so many fascinating speakers here today, committed to sustainability in different ways. From artists to self-organized initiatives, curators with larger organizations, freelancers and museum directors, we have a whole spectrum. And you'll see the overlap in the speakers, and I must commend Malmö Konstmuseum for their thoughtful composition of this seminar. But you can also get involved. I will be fed your questions from the Facebook and YouTube chats. So please pose them as we go along, and I'll address them at the end of each panel. So once a question pops up in your mind, put it in the chat and it will be fed to me. Now, we only have 30 minutes at our disposal, so each panelist will present a brief introduction of maximum 5 minutes before we head into a discussion, and I will be brutal when it comes to timekeeping. So without further ado, allow me to introduce the first panel, which is Louise Farskog, a curator, cultural entrepreneur, and founder and director of Art 2030. She will be in dialogue with Jan Vår, a highly acclaimed artist whose work you may have encountered as large-scale institutions that spring from personal encounters and allied cultural artifacts, made strange by their juxtaposition in places such as the Venice Biennial, the Guggenheim Museum in New York, RSMK in Copenhagen, or as large-scale public art commissions. So we will start with Louisa, with you. Maybe just start with what is Art 2030? I think you're muted, Louisa.
Is this better?
Yes,
Good.
there you go.
Art 2030 is a non-profit organization that on a global scale is connecting art with the United Nations global goals. And we do that via engaging our colleagues in the sector and making direct projects together with artists.
Great. And you're working with Jan, who is now on a line with us.
Yes, I have the pleasure. And yeah, I think, Jan, you probably don't need a lot of introduction, but I think it's so interesting in this context to ask to discuss with you on how you have in recent years started to work more and more with nature in your practice.
Yeah.
Yeah. So perhaps we should jump right into it and talk about the garden as a sculpture.
Yeah, like in my mind, I don't have these kind of definition. I think a lot of good decisions that happened in my life was like these unforeseen ones, no? So when I built it like an archive outside of Berlin, there was like some land connected to it, not much. Oh.
Ooh. Okay, I think we lost Jan for a moment. Is that correct?
Sounds like it. It sounded like he was attacked by something. I hope he's okay.
I think it's okay. Okay, but then I can tell I can share with you that Jan is at his studio an hour outside of Berlin, where he has in recent years has been his primarily studio, and surrounding it he has been growing a garden.
And while we wait for him to return, perhaps you could say a little bit about the current project that you're working with him on, which is also a formal garden.
Yes, we in next week actually we are inaugurating a project at Våra malerisamling north of Copenhagen, which is a classical painting museum. But they have, on Jan's inspiration, acquired a piece of land, a small plot next to the station of Våra, at Nivå station. And here it's literally a blank sheet of land, totally uncultivated. It's a former DSB railway ground. So, and there we will be starting next week with a project where where Jan will, together with specialists from other fields, among others, primarily a biodiversity professor, Carsten Rabeck, develop a garden. So from now, it's really a blank sheet or blank canvas, and then it will develop there. I think what's very interesting with that project is that it's how it relates to time, because we are so used to working with all these deadlines, exhibitions. We have a lot of expectations on what is a project, an art project or a sculpture, or and that different art media is sort of turning into specific art products, where what I really like about this project is that it doesn't meet any of those expectations. So when if you come next Thursday when we open, there will not be a lot to see, because this is the beginning of a long-term project where the learning process of it is essential. And probably you can't really see it in full blossom until perhaps a year from now, 100 years from now. So it will be, we are actually letting the nature grow into a project itself. And so in full bloom, perhaps more like in the age of oak tree than in the usual perspective of an exhibition.
And is this the first time you've been working with this slightly original time frame, or is this how you work with artists in general?
On a general level, I think the whole idea, my focus is to try to understand the artist practice and then follow that and support that in the way of, for instance, with this project, to bring in expertise, specialists from other fields, like the biodiversity professor. We're also doing another project where we are bringing in chefs and others, but here it will be together with a biodiversity professor. Hello back, Jan.
Yeah, sorry, I tried to get the music way.
Okay.
No, anyhow,
just briefly explaining about Nivågård, but please share your reflections on the garden as a media or
so it was through weird circumstances that I got involved with a garden in principle. I mean, if you met me 4 years ago, I would be afraid of ringworms. And but I thank God I have like a sense of curiosity, and I had this extra land, and I hired like a part-time gardener to help me working with it. And then suddenly 4 years after, I find myself totally obsessed with understanding what grows on the ground better, and the weather, and all these kind of elements that's super connected to each other. No, I mean, one of the best gifts is that you learn the relationship to each other. When I was younger, I would love like a sunny day like this, which I still do. But I also know when it rains, it's good, because then I don't need like to stand there and water the plants. So it creates like other kind of value systems that I just didn't thought much about. And patience, no? One of the best gifts from working with the garden is that I've been very spoiled in my as an artist, because I did a lot of exhibitions, and people gave me a lot of opportunities to do things on demand almost, no? But here, I learned that you can't plant like a big tree immediately. You have like to, for the best condition, plant them smaller and have them create like better root systems and stuff. And it was actually because the gardener I'm working with refused to plant bigger trees, so I just had to accept it. And that's a good thing, because then you also learn patience by it, and I think that's a virtue today.
Yeah, definitely it is a virtue. And I also think that leads me to talk with you about time, because we have many different time of time. We have ecological time, we have human time. We need to deal with perhaps reconcile ourselves with time, and that good things takes time.
For sure. I mean, I think it's also like I really believe that one should be able to look at things in different ways. And of course we can avoid like thinking in human time, because we are in the end human. But I think it's also very giving to understand times on other perspective. I mean, and it's not a new thing. Like in old times in culture, you would build like temples or cathedrals or mosques over centuries, no? And somehow we just lost that a bit in this moment of time, no?
Yeah, you might even tear down the temple and rebuild them to have a relation to time, but also to the skills.
Exactly. Yeah, that's the crazy Japanese, no? But I think it's just worth it for me to understand all these perspectives of things, no? And that gives me, also an artist that I'm very involved with, Isamu Noguchi. I mean, he planted, like when he did his museum and archive, he planted like all the trees in an age of 80 years old, like very small, and he knew that he didn't get to see them grown out, no? And but that was also what made him such a good artist, because he also worked with big stones, and he always said that, you know, the great thing about stone, masonry is that you can do mistake as human being, you know, but water will take its tooth on it and repair it if it goes wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what the Japanese are good at. They really believe that the rain is the master of sculpture. No, that's why they keep on watering the sculptures all the time, which drive people crazy. They're one that wants things to stay as it is, frozen in time. No?
Yeah, but also we've also been discussing very much about sort of that a central part of your practice is to look in how our desires are being, what determines our desires or values, and how are they drivers for us. I also think you relate with your gardening projects, you really relate to challenging these desires. When we lost you for a moment, I was just saying that the project in Nivo will actually start out with a blank field.
Yeah.
Which is also challenging our desires or expectations, and at a time in a place and time where we really have to redefine everything, including our values, in order to have a future on this planet. I think it's very relevant to bring that desires in. Perhaps you could speak a little about.
Yeah, I think it's two different threads. No, like one is for me, and I think also for a lot of people in the art, in the visual arts, have like a lack of information regarding what we think as nature. No, I didn't find in my past a lot of relevant discussions about it, or information that artists or cultural institutions were working on. And so I really think that in one hand it's a learning process. No, I mean, it's a learning process for me, and in the other hand, it's what I can bring into it is from the art, from my practice as an artist, is like this questioning of value systems. No, and I think that's very refreshing when you dive into a field where you have so little knowledge about it, that you can see things with fresh eyes. No, and what I basically is to, you know, my interest in desires is that it, you know, I never was really good in formulating it before. I could do it. How I did it was that I was talking about that our inner desires is many times already brought up by other interests outside of yourself. No, whether it's like fashion that wants you to buy Yves Saint Laurent or H&M or whatever they fight for, or love life even. I think is like an occupied field, like that doesn't come from one from within. So in that sense, I always was against desires, because they are most of the times they are traps for yourself. And I think today I can specify it a little bit better, because I think that desires is also enclosing your way of looking at other things. No, like if you like roses, you have difficulties to make a bouquet out of dandelions. So, you know, like it limits your curiosity, I think. And I think probably that's what I determine as the worst enemy within yourself, because it prevents you to go on new journeys.
Yeah, so it's our definition of what is weeds and what is flowers. It's a construction. So because actually the weed can be equally as beautiful as the rose, but it's the way we define values and desires that determines what we think is beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah. And all these elements is incorporated in the garden idea of Nivo, because it's like, one is time, you know, like if it to look like the most beautiful flower garden next year, we're gonna have to force it. But what is it that creates like our desire to see it next year? You know, I have like a starting point where I think that one have to, you know, like that's what I do with the gardens. No, I mean, I cutted a lot of trees and dig out a lot of flowers or weeds for many years, and I reached to a point where I say at least, okay, cut the trees, know the name of the tree that you are cutting, or know the name of the weed that you are taking out at least, you know. So it has the time aspect that we are talking about, but then also it incorporates like the thing that we think, you know, like why is roses better than certain weeds, you know, and even, you know, like when you talk about invasive species, weeds or flowers, even when you dig into the roots, you know, and then you suddenly find like that these fantastic ways of different plants to try to survive, no? And it's all different kind of methods of surviving, and they're all like beautiful in their own terms, no? But we don't know that unless we have I always consider it as a clay or steel when I do sculptures, that you understand the what this thing you have in your hand, no? And from there, like develop a certain way of looking at it aesthetically. So for me, it's very important that you start up, now that I have a little bit of experience, to start up with a blank sheet where you say, okay, I know nothing about how the garden should look like, but let's look at what's in the soil and what comes out of it. And the best thing of a garden is that it has its own time, or plants or nature, whatever you call it. It has its own, it has a different time, no? And I think that's super interesting.
Yeah.
I love like this idea of very fragile flowers with not a good root system. They can have seeds that lies in the soil for 100 years because they just wait for the moment, no? And I think that's a beautiful idea.
Yeah, and that's also back to Nivo, sort of taking the starting point in what is there originally, and then bring in other experts, for instance, like Carsten Rabeck, the biodiversity professor, to I see it very much also as a journey of learning from yourself, but you're sharing that learning journey with the audiences.
Yeah, because I think, I mean, my ideal is that it's like, I think it's for, you know, like how can we do a change unless the artists are changing and the institution? And when we engage in these projects, I think, you know, like that's what I tell the director of the museum. Then we should use like this extra money on all, like educate all the people in the museum, no? Because it's like, how do you speak of something without actually knowing about it? And so I think I always said that if you want to make any changes, you have to do it within yourself, you know, and then it starts with the partners that you're working with, and then maybe we get like some kind of substance that we can speak for public, no?
Yeah, but also in that you're really challenging, I think, the way that a museum traditionally works, because usually we in the art world we work very up to tight deadlines, and then with a big bang we are launching a big project or a big exhibition. We're very secretive about it, and then there it is. This is actually doing it in the opposite, totally opposite direction. I see.
Yeah, I mean, and that's important, you know. Like I think in through the whole, at least modernist history, you try to break the frameworks, and I mean, all the frameworks of an exhibition or where art should be has always been challenged, you know. And at the moment, it's just been dominated by a certain ideology. But of course, that's changeable. Nothing is written in stone, no. And I think. I mean, I think it's just always important to question, like the role of the artist or the institution at the moment, and how we can propose something else that we believe is more relevant. No?
Yeah, perhaps it's also relevant to mention that the images that has been shown on the screen is from your studio outside of Berlin, and now we can see you are there on a sunny summer day. But all of these pictures are from winter, and I know that is on purpose. So why is it all winter images?
Yeah, like everything in the summer just grows beautifully, or what we think is beautifully, But I really learned, and I didn't, like outside of Berlin, haven't been snowing like for a long time. So just to, I did like exercise earlier, and that was like for most of my adult life, I always escape. I grew up in Denmark, which also has like a long winter, and I always escaped to Thailand or Mexico when it was winter, because we thought I always believed that it was a little bit too harsh to stay in these dark days in cold Denmark or Germany for that matter. But then since I started to work with the garden, I decided 3 years to fly back on the 21st of December, which is the winter solstice in Northern Europe, just to see what it means like to be in these dark days of the year, and I actually got to really love it. Like you see, I started to see colors in a different way, and I started to, and this year was so beautiful because it's when it's snow, it's actually really good for the plants here in Northern Europe, because they protect like the plants. The problem when you don't have snow is that that when you get frost, the snow actually becomes a cover, so the earth is not frozen. And the problem when you don't have snow is that when you have the frozen soil, it actually what do you call it? Droughts out the water, because the water is ice, so the plants cannot get water, and that's actually what is really bad for the garden when you doesn't have the snow cover. So then to see like just a garden with snow, it's just like that's what it needs, and that makes it even more beautiful, I think. So it's these kind of things that creates in a way aesthetics, like when you see the purpose of something and the relevance and the reasons, then you understand it better, and that's actually how I think should create like reasons that creates why you think something is better than other or more beautiful than other things.
Opening up our eyes. And I guess that's also, I know Tomiko is probably being tough in a very short moment. So I think this is actually a beautiful place to make the circle back to art as a catalyst for change, because at this time where we really are at a crucial time on a planetary level, humans really have to reconcile with nature. So thank you very much, Jan, for sharing these reflections with us. And we look much forward to follow the development over the years to come.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting us in outside. We have a comment from the Facebook chat, which is from Riley Rieg. I'm an ecologist and also an art maker. Wish there was a way to combine these interests in academic work as well. Not so much a question, but a comment. Would either of you like to respond to that? Or should we just share their lament?
Could you repeat it?
As an ecologist and an art maker, I wish there was a way to combine these interests, ecology and art making, in academic work as well.
But I think that's a lot of ways to do that, and that it is being done at the exhibition in Malmö and everything around it. That's my view on it. And I think there are, in more classical academic ways, Dora Hathaway and Timothy Morton, and I think the list is long of also on a more theoretical note, if that was the question.
Yes, so there you go. Donna Haraway and Timothy Morton are somewhere to start from the Ivy League to be looking at this. I had a quick question for you, Jan, which was, you talked about starting this process just relatively recently, 4 years ago. Do you see it as a shift in your artistic practice, or as an extension, perhaps, of your artistic practice?
Yeah, that depends on how you look at it, no? I mean, I think I always wanted, like, through my work as an artist, develop a certain way of thinking, and with this imply it on whatever I do, you know, like, and that's why in my art, what I've been producing before, it has been like, like a big mess. I like do big things, small things, or work on paper or whatever I find around. No, so I think as an artist, you just think in a certain way, and with this thinking, you like, if it's flowers you have in your hands, or a piece of stone, you know, I think in a certain way it's the same. But if you, so I actually don't think of it as a shift. Probably it is, you know.
And one final question to you, with the idea of the confines of the gallery, what are some of the benefits or some of the challenges of working outside?
That you have the element of the plans that creates its own time, you know? And that you have to push for it. I mean, I think also you should push for it in a gallery space. If you know, like, all these deadlines, I've never been like a big fan of those things, and I didn't respect it either. So, but I think the garden learns me to be more, give me more strength in that.
I could advise also to have a look at White Cube's homepage, because your exhibition last year at White Cube, you had actually integrated a number of these thoughts inside the gallery space as well.
Yeah.
So there's a nice movement from inside and outside. We have a couple of more questions, but we are running out of time, unfortunately. So they will be addressed on Facebook. And I think you've also covered a few of them in your really beautiful explication of your garden and this way of working. It really nice way of setting the tone for the rest of the seminar. And thank you, Louisa, for guiding this conversation into the core matters. So it remains for me to thank Jan and Louisa, and then move on to the next panel. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Bye. Okay, so now we have our next panel. I told you it would be swift. The next panel is entitled Ecology as a Means of Inclusion, and features artist Mary Mattingly, curator Joa Ljungberg, and Kirse Junge Stensborg, who's director of Malmö Konstmuseum. So we will remain with the art, if you like, with Mary, who will talk to us briefly about her Swale project. And again, to our online audiences, please put your questions in the chat, both on YouTube and on Facebook, and we'll address them provided there's time. But now let me give the word to Mary.
Thank you, Taminka. I have some images that I could scroll through, but I just wanted to start by saying, often I transform industrial equipment and personal objects. And through that, I'm constantly learning about materiality and can attempt to really co-build living systems or follies that grow or often can float or are even maybe performatively pulled in some cases. I practice sculpture and photography with the distinctions between these mediums really collapsing in a more dialogic relationship that I see as at times being experiential and also durational. I spent a few years accounting for the objects in my possession, and I could show you some images. I'm not sure if they're coming up. There we go. Can go to the next image. So yeah, that's perfect. Thank you so much. So accounting for these objects in my possession before sort of bundling them into large boulders and pulling them to describe my own consumption. You can go to the next. I think to me, the sculpture and photograph can tend to question, but I believe that they can also change perspectives and perceptions. So here, palm trees from more tropical agricultural zones 9 and 10 were transplanted into agricultural zones 5 and 6 in upstate New York, which is in a way a speculative proposal for assisted plant migration within climate change that sort of made people look twice, and as a proposal and speculation can be a means to imagine more potentially regenerative futures, which is really what drives me. I was raised outside of New York City in an agricultural town where drinking water was polluted from pesticides like DDT well into the 1980s after it was illegal, and water ended up, for me, being a continual concern. So I began building sculptures that really, I guess, actualized those concerns about access to water and basic needs. And they started as wearable devices and became maybe more collaborative public spaces. And you can go to the next image. So this project is called Swale. And in this project, I think my focus was not only on water, but also on food. This is in New York City, in a city where currently about 1 in 3 people lives in what's, excuse me, in what's considered a food desert. Swale is a reused barge and an intentionally provocative floating food forest that can point to forms of extraction and also regeneration. So growing or picking food on public land in New York City has been illegal for almost a century. And so Swale can be provocative in a sense, a public artwork that also uses the common laws of the water as a loophole to get around what is still currently illegal on land. You can go to the next slide. So Swale's a platform where anyone can pick fresh foods for free, really because not only because of its illegality on land, but also because, well, some residents have access to the 100 acres of community garden space in New York City. The city actually manages 30,000 acres of public parkland. So in following traditional ecological knowledge and insights of people like Eleanor Ostrom, who claim that in a vibrant commons, people had a vital role to play, not only as beneficiaries, but also as co-creators and protectors and decision makers. In a litigious city like New York City, sometimes that can seem far from the realities there. But from land, Swale resembles a small island. You can go to the next image. But water's buoyant properties allow the barge to really bob up and down on the water at the edges of New York City. In a way, it's out of place in order to ask people to question their surroundings, from what happens to be still polluted waterways to a lack of fresh food access. I think you can go to the next image. Picking apples from a landmass with an orchard displacing the river on a floating flat deck barge, I think can be disarming. And after a while, there's a potential shift in perception, and somebody may feel like they're standing still and the skyline is moving, not them. And I found that when people are asked to pick food in public, suddenly they want to know where the water comes from, and then they want to learn about the soil. I think you can go to the next image. So here you can see sort of the barge perspective in the city in the background. I think in this case, Swale can offer maybe a macroscopic view into a relative microscopic ecosystem. So it's contained on this 40 by 10 meter platform, and one change can upset the ecosystem across the barge. And I think in that way, you can really also experience change and effects of change. I think a folly in this case can surprise people and ask folks to really reconsider their surroundings, perhaps even to the point where folks see different types of value in public spaces. And you can go to the next slide. And as a direct result of Swale, with the support of a lot of community groups, in 2017, the Parks Department did open their first public foodway on land in Concrete Plant Park in the Bronx, and hopefully it's the first of many. I think in this case, art could be seen as a catalyst or as an experiential platform to try to understand what something like this could do on public land. You can go to the next slide, please. So for the past few years, I've been co-building these site-specific reading rooms that ask people to view geologic specimens as provocations for a time of more and more extreme climate change. So a time when geologic change can be witnessed in the span of a human's lifetime. You can go to the next slide. And so this is in process. I think these reading rooms can ask people to look beyond the immediate and into the future through recordings of the past to have a long view. So here, reading rooms on the Thames explore a riparian flora with attention given to the nipa palms that used to line the shores there. And the sculpture on the right is the nipa leaves, and then on the left are the seeds and some of the current plants that are growing on the estuarial plants that are growing in the Thames. And you can go to the next slide. So this is an early sketch of a temporary monument to temporary forests. In 2022, the Våra reading room would be a room in transition. So its walls really referenced by posts made with salvaged lumber from the major present day tree species of Malmö. So the standalone posts contain a series of shelves displaying fossil remnants. The structure comprises a timeline of forest migration that looks towards challenges for tree species living with climate change. So from changing temperatures and variable rainfall to longer fire seasons and pathogens and insects. It sort of does this by looking underground again. So as far down as the Cenozoic era to species that did inhabit Northern Europe at the time. And you can go to the final slide. Another sketch, so alongside human-assisted plant migration, where botanists in Sweden, as I understand, are really looking at predictive forest models a few decades ahead of current warming. The reading room can hopefully ask people to think about including a diversity of species that can handle increased weather fluctuations and increasingly warmer temperatures. So over the past 5 years, for a little bit of background, I've been able to watch the US Forest Service employ assisted plant migration to move large amounts of trees to places they couldn't easily migrate themselves. So for the timeline that they're perceived to be up against, I've seen ginkgo and metasequoia being planted far from their current homes in the hopes of building regenerative forestry in times of climate change. And I'm wondering if some of those diverse tree species found deep in Sweden's fossil record that include mangroves and palms could begin to resurface today. So this reading room illustrates forests in Malmö over time to help imagine more regenerative eco-social futures with that understanding that climate change would continue to alter surroundings in ways that could make them unrecognizable. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that incredibly rich presentation of your work. There are some questions in the chat which I'll return to after Joa and Kirsi's initial presentation. So Joa, will move on to you and your curatorial work, Sensing Nature from Within, which was at Moderna Museet in Malmö last year.
Yes, that's right. Thank you for inviting me here. Very interesting to hear all the presentations. Thank you, Mary. It was very interesting to hear you. So I have, on my part, been asked to speak shortly about this exhibition project, Sensing Nature from Within, which I curated for Moderna Museet Malmö in year 2019. And as the title conveys, this was a project imbued with a desire to move beyond the dualistic nature of Western thought that has taught us to separate culture from nature, human from animal, mind from body, etc., etc., to move beyond this very powerful system of ideas that has also proven so dangerous and destructive. So rather than contributing with practical solutions for increased sustainability, this project wanted to engage more in a philosophical and existential way in the search for a different worldview and a different code of ethics, even if in a minimal way. As a project, it consisted of an art exhibition and also of a rich program with lectures, discussions, performances, and dance. And as such, it presented not only artists, but also philosophers, scientists, historians, writers, etc., that in their various practices have challenged this notion of nature dominating a Western modernity, and in doing so have also contributed to an opening up of mental doors to other, more life-affirming understandings of nature. And this project, of course, didn't just come from nowhere. On the contrary, it was strongly inspired by the intensified search for other ways of thinking and living that has grown with the knowledge about man's catastrophic impact on ecologies and climate, and that have tried to navigate away from a logic that has rationalized and mechanized the world at the expense of life itself. The writer, scholar, and deep ecologist Joanna Macy has nicely put it like this, and I quote her: "The most remarkable feature of this historical moment is not that we are on the way of destroying our world. We have actually been on the way for quite a while. It is rather that we are beginning to wake up as from a millennia-long sleep to a whole new relationship to our world, to ourselves, and to each other." So to put it short, Sensing Nature from Within was a project freely inspired by new and ancient insights into life and matter. And it was a project that reflected and engaged with this intensified search for a new code of ethics beyond our exploitative culture. It provided a platform amongst many other important platforms where people could learn about, discuss, and engage with this myriad of thoughts, knowledge, and speculation. And it was a project that addressed its visitors as sensuous beings, involving them through poetry, dance, music, science, storytelling, and many other forms of knowledge and expression. And now I don't know where the images disappeared, but if we could go perhaps to the second image in my, that one, which shows the first big space in the exhibition where we had an encounter between Ursula Biemann and Pablo Tavares' video essay from Ecuadorian Amazonas forest law. And on the other side, an installation by Christine Ödlund that engaged in a playful and artistic way with recent scientific findings within the field of plant cognition. And if we can quickly move to image number 5, we can stay a little bit with. So not that one, the one before, I think. Yeah, that one, which shows a still from the film by the Autolit group, O Horizon, which is a film that revitalizes the ecosophical thinking of Rabindranath Tagore, an Indian writer, poet, artist, and philosopher, who, amongst many other things, founded this radical school outside of Calcutta, where he brought back the arts into the education and where he also brought back the students into the natural landscape, aiming to foster a holistic subjectivity. And I'm reaching the end soon, but I would like to show you just a few images of Hannah Jung's curiosity cabinets that comes next. Yeah, maybe we can even go to the image after that. This is a series of sculpture that displays various metals and minerals that we extract industrially on daily basis, but that are also natural components of our own human bodies. So it's really a series of works that invites us to meditate on our relationship to mountains, rocks, stone, and earth. And finally, the last two images, that one, yes, shows a performance by Ingela Irman as the giant clam. And thereafter you have an image also from the dance performance Monstra, which was choreographed by Elisabeth Finger and Manuela Eichner and danced by 5 women together with 5 plants that during the course of this performance turned wilder and wilder and crazier and potentially even dangerous at some point. So thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that presentation. And also to say or remind viewers that Ingela Irman, the Queen of the Night, will also be screened at the end of this seminar. There are questions coming up in the chat, which is great, and they've been timed in the way that we can actually answer them in this session, which is wonderful, so keep them coming. But I will hand over now to Kirse for her presentation around sustainable societies for the future, and then return to these audience questions after that. Kirse, off you go.
So thank you very much, and also thank you, Joa and Mary, for your presentations. I want to give a little view on sustainable societies for the future and the whole idea of what we tried to put into scene with the project. It consists of several aspects. It has consisting of the exhibition here in Malmö, performances, also a publication, also different kinds of talks, workshops, and it's also this collaboration with the Expo Chicago, and also with the scene in Chicago Art 2030. And so for us, it has been important with the project to raise these urgent questions on many levels. The idea was to look into sustainable societies for the future from the perspective on the global goal number 11, how to create sustainable cities and communities. And we wanted to ask some of the most complex and urgent challenges or questions for today: how to create safe, inclusive, and sustainable societies. How can we generate new ideas and actions for a sustainable world? And how can we act as stimulant for a more sustainable way of living? So also the seminars here are part of this ambition to discuss these questions and share, and also be generous with our perspectives, ideas, experiment on how we can act for a better world. The highlight maybe you can go on to next image. The idea for picking number 11 goal was to sort of look into this specific ideas of also how to create community to also be sustainable for a larger group, and also to expand to think about how we live with nature, and also how we live in cities, communities, can sort of build something new and have a new look and perspectives on our living today. If you go to the next image, we sort of took departure in looking at the 3 dimensions of sustainability: the ideological, the social, the economic perspective. And this seminar is also a part of a series of several seminars where this seminar is looking more into the environmental perspectives and the more ideological challenges we are facing. We also look how we can create a society where human rights are related also to this organic, ecological, our relation with nature, and how we can look at the consequences for the people, the plants, and the animals, and also these questions of biodiversity, and how artists have been looking at nature. We have invited approximately 20 artists for the exhibition here in Malmö. Artists and artist groups working with the three different ways of looking at sustainability. Also, many of the artists working with all three perspectives, interlinking, looking at the interlink between the perspectives. And the artists are coming from the Nordic countries and also from the US. So we have this kind of mirroring of urging, burning questions for the Nordic art scene, and also for the art scene in the United States at the moment. We have been collaborating closely with our Nordic team and the team at here in Malmö, and also with Expo and Stephanie Costello as a curator. So in that sense, we have this also different ways of addressing these questions seen from a more Nordic welfare perspective, and also seeing at the most urgent issues at stake from the artist perspectives at the moment. If you give one more image, I just give you a few look into some of the art pieces we have on view. One more week here in Malmö, or 5 more days, and these images I have picked are more with the works dealing with the nature as a starting point. This is Katrin Andersson. It's 2 pieces interlinked with the one called Ancient Blue, with the color of the ice core, oldest ice core in the world, 2,700 years old, and it's the ice core where you can actually see layers for all the carbon dioxide from all the times, and you can sort of see the environmental impact on our world, how we have also treated the climate, treated the nature, treated our globe. And also in the small bottles in front, we can see 5 years indicators of pollution in this Gulf of Baltic Sea and Gulf of Bothnia, and it shows the ink in the investigations into or prints into the analysis of the ice, and the amount of ice is showing the more color you have in the bottles, the better it has been for the ice for the year. So it's really also is a kind of instrument of visual instruments of looking at climate change. The next image, it's by Michael X. Ryan. That is a piece of land art moved into a gallery setting. It's a piece where it's a frame where it's piece 1-to-1 from a sandbank in Chicago. It's called Oxbow Waterline, and it's an important place for artist communities in the Chicago history. But it's also showing really the change in nature. It's you can redo this piece now because it's a mold where you can do the sand again and again. But it's also super fragile piece where you can see the whole sensitive environmental effects and aspects on nature, and also the whole water level that is changing at the moment everywhere. So if you go to that Oxbow water line place now, it would look totally different and not existing. And then the last piece, it's by Iko Halso, a photographic image, Forest of Sponsors, and it's also a piece where you can see like nature is treated in a tough way, also by commercial interest. It's a critique of, you can say, but you have the image of the nature, but if you look into the image more deeply, you see a lot of name of sponsors placed on the trees, like Sony and commercial big companies. And it's also really about how you treat the nature and the resources you have for actually building communities and building a society that is worth living in for humans and all people, plants, and also for the whole planet to have like this ecosystem. So that was from me now, and the idea of the Sustainable Societies for the Future project.
Great, thank you, Kisa. I think it's really great to have that introduction to the exhibition. And of course, there are works in that exhibition, as we will see in the later panels, that survive or supersede the confines of the exhibition being up at Malmö Konstmuseum. Back to our online audience briefly, because like I said earlier, there is a bit of a backlog in terms of when the questions have been asked, apart from Exemplary by Apollonia Sustasik, which is directed to Mary. So allow me to ask that now straight away, why people formulate their other questions for the other panelists. Apollonia, thanks you for an interesting presentation. People's engagement is important. So I'm wondering who is maintaining the swale?
That's such a good question. And I think it's something that, doing swale, I realize that sometimes it's more important to have the maintenance considered than even doing the project to begin with. And it's, I've been, I think, really fortunate in that project to, I guess, have my own learning experience of being able to let go and give that project over to other folks who could keep it going. So right now it's in the hands of the Brooklyn Borough President's Office to, and they're looking, so it's not in my hands anymore. And I think the maintenance for a long time had been done by a summer youth employment program in the summertime, and then staff that was there during the year. But it was, I'd say in the beginning of the project, absolutely a labor of love and something we weren't sure could even continue past the first 6 months, but it seemed worthwhile to try anyway. And luckily it did build enough momentum so we could afford to keep it going for another 3 years before it was handed over. Long answer.
No, great answer. And maybe I can follow up with, and what is the plans for the proposal in Malmö that you sketched for us?
So the plans are that it would go into the park across from the museum next spring.
And how would that, because I think I'm reading from the questions that have come, a lot of people have been interested in this idea of, one can make these artworks, one can do these projects, but how does one involve the audience in the learning process? So maybe, I know it's difficult to answer, particularly with a project which is yet to be realized, but it is also important to build these ideas into the projects even before they start. And I understand also that you're obviously working remotely on this, and maybe as a sort of singular artist on this. But what are the plans for keeping that kind of outdoor reading room going, or mediating it, if you like, or letting people participate in it?
Well, so far it's collecting poems or lines from poems that would go on to the polls, and as a way to storytell about a potential future. I think that that's a great point. I think we need more chances to be stewards, and I guess in terms of like how I think art can be most viable in public is being agents and stewards in public space is something that I don't think that we have a lot of chances to let happen, especially in cities. And so, yeah, this project is starting with the collection of poems, and then will continue to the building process. And I'm not really, I think right now it's a little bit on hold, and I'd say over the summertime we should figure out the next steps. But yeah, pandemic, being remote unexpectedly and things like that have absolutely slowed it down, but we do have the hopes that it will be in public in 2022.
That's one of many things to look forward to. And it sounds like a really beautiful project. More questions from the chat, which I think is one that goes to, well, all of us here really today, but I think it should be directed to kids originally, since you've used this term sustainability for both the exhibition and the sort of project as a whole. Again, from Apollonia Systersik, the word sustainability seems quite used and abused for the last 20 years and well adopted by the market economy. The feminist Doina Petrescu is suggesting to change it rather into resilience. What do you think about this, Kirsa?
I think actually maybe you could work on both kind of concepts, or how you are dealing with this, but also if we want to address these urgent questions also into a more formal political discourse, I think it's also nice that you can sort of use some of the words in this case also related to the sustainable global goals, as they are also it's sort of the framework for the political agenda for actually acting and doing something. But at the other hand, I think also as an art scene and as a potential creating other views, and I think that's it's maybe important to make a complex understanding of this, so we can sort of embrace both the more official language and way we can make important acts or impacts, but also that we make a space for creativity, new ways of thinking, and in that sense it's not closed or embarked by the concept. So I agree on this, that it's very important that we sort of make it, we can experiment and create free ideas as well.
Great, thank you. And online audience, keep your questions coming. I had one for you, Wa. Well, firstly, the fact that you're sensing nature from within, obviously, in the way you described it, having this engaging philosophically and theoretically with the concept of nature provides a good reading list for the person who was asking about this more academic perspective on art and ecology. But I also wanted maybe to ask you about your forthcoming project, which is listed in your biography, Research for the Land of Twilight. Could you say something about that?
Oh, I was not prepared for that question. It's a very early stage, but somehow I feel that the exhibition project Sensing Nature from Within has a relationship back to an earlier project I worked with for several years that I call The New Human. And so this future project that you're asking about has also, again, a relationship to Sensing Nature from Within and back to The New Human. And yeah, I'm in the early phase of research, but I think it's interesting that we are moving through a kind of land of twilight, both in terms of democracy and ecology, and which feels very frightening and worrying, but it has also catalyzed this search that I was also talking about in my presentation for other ways of thinking, other ways of living, other ways of understanding the world. So there is also a freedom and creativity in this kind of situation of being on the border, if you can say. But I don't know if I want to talk so much more in detail about it because it's so early on, but I very much see it as a continuation of sensing nature from within.
No, thank you very much. I didn't mean to throw that at you unprepared, but I think it's a really nice way of seeing that this is a longer standing commitment to the issues, where you have a number of different projects which kind of examine it and come at it from different angles. And it partly answers also a comment on Facebook from a Nils Peter Flint, which was made before this panel started, to be fair, who says, I've worked, and I quote, with sustainability and design for the past 35 years. In design, we've developed numerous activities far more radical than what I hear from the art world today. So not directed at you, but the art world in general. When do we see real radical minds come into action? To me, it seems very much like the art world is finally opening up to art being part of a movement that is most important in today's world. So I think we can probably agree with his comments, but maybe I can bring in Kirsa. I mean, do you think that he's right in his assessment that this is a relatively recent turn in the art world?
No, I actually don't think it is in that sense, but I think maybe to work on a more, you can say, visible, more political level, that's maybe, and also so working more with acts for a better world. Also, as we heard with Art 2030, that's also a body working with these questions, and Louise has been like pioneer within this field, also linking to the UN and the agenda for sustainable global goals. So in that sense, maybe to work to combine the more sensitive or creative way of producing art within what is urgent and interesting for the artist, and also what seems relevant. So in that sense, I think we have many really, really fantastic within the art world examples, also more historic pieces that we can bring into mind. So.
Yes, agreed. There's a question here from a Jessica Eliasson, on Facebook, which I think it is about Swale, but it is a question about Malmö. Can one grow food in the city of Malmö? And what insights would Swale want to offer the citizens of Malmö? I think that, because Mary, the sense is not to bring Swale to Malmö. I mean, Swale is living happily in New York, but maybe the thinking from there.
Yeah, I think with Swale, what was, when we were laying the groundwork for Swale, we were in touch with community boards and groups about what people wanted to see growing on Swale. And that was how, besides companion planting methods, which also were utilized, that was how we sort of devised the plant list. And, the hope, I think, after Swale, and I think lots of places in New York City are doing this already, is that you would have more places where people could input into the design of public spaces. And also, I would love to comment on the comment before. I think that art, is really essential, and I don't think it's something that we should forget. It asks us, to question, not to find answers, but to uncover deeper questions. And I think that's so different from design and science, where you're questioning to find answers. But there's something that's so essential about delving deep into these questions and co-imagining and bringing up dreaming together, and how all of these different ways of working need to find find ways to work together, essentially. So that would be my response to that comment earlier as well.
Yeah, beautiful response to that comment, which rounds off this panel rather nicely. I want to thank Mary, Joa, and Kirse for their presentations and their engagement, and then hasten on to the next panel. Thank you very much. Okay, and our next panel is entitled Showing the Way, and it's with Lucia Pietrusti, who is a curator of general ecology of a project at the Serpentine Galleries in London, Sanna Ritvanen, who is an artist and vice chair of the Mustarinda Association in Finland, and Malin Lubell, who is an artist and a gardener. And here we will also have the opportunity to pick up on one of the last concepts that Mary mentioned, which is companion planting. So in this one, we'll reverse the scale, if you like, from the last panel, and we'll start with the institutional curator, then go via the self-organized project, and finish with the so-called singular artist, albeit someone who works very collaboratively. So, Lucia, what is the General Ecology Project?
So, hello, thank you so much, Tominga, and also to Gabriel and to Sanna and Malin, of course, for sharing the stage, and to all the organizers and participants for sharing this time together. Well, you've mentioned the General Ecology Project, which I will sort of quickly get to, but panning out, I would just say that I'm a curator working at the intersection of art and the environment, with a particular focus on working outside of the exhibition format. And I was just reminded yesterday, I had the incredible and quite intimidating privilege to be in conversation with Dr. Yuba Sukona, the vice chair of the IPCC. And we both agreed that we're kind of living through, from the arts responsibilities perspective, something like a crisis in imagination, but not a crisis in imagination in terms of lacking in any imagination, but more a situation of monoculturalization of imagination, much as we do with crops. So assuming that very far from a single and miraculous and somehow as yet unseen solution, all of climate balance and justice responses will continue to feel to us, at least in the short term, like myriad of countless situated, different, interconnected micro responses that hopefully work. I just wanted to begin by noting that having spent quite a bit of time working in collaboration with organizations and individuals who do focus on the environment, but don't, let's say, have their primary focus within the arts, I realized that the expectations of what art can do tend to be quite high, but actually generally quite vague. And that they also remain quite narrowly focused on this kind of elusive and general notion of making science or complex data intelligible or beautiful or infleshed in some way. And so we hear a lot of talk about spreading awareness as if a public understanding of science itself could make these giant and stacked hegemonic systems make a kind of instant U-turn on almost everything, which is de facto what we kind of need to get to. So, you know, without wanting to oversimplify the incredibly complex, if we think about what art can be for, and I think it sort of speaks to the comment that we heard just before, it does function towards public mobilization or public awareness, certainly. It also engages quite deeply in certain cases with systemic change. I'm thinking about the ways in which experiments within the art context, as we've just heard, can actually set themselves up in quite a different way than something like a scientific experiment has to, and that is to say, without necessarily having an intended outcome in mind or allowing oneself to fail. All of these things are actually quite restricted in other environments. And then also something that I find particularly stimulating, which is the question of passing as art. Sometimes passing as art can leverage all kinds of different trajectories and different people and different organizations along its sort of life from concept to funding to delivery that might be, you know, just not necessarily easier, but definitely different from the ones that a permaculture project or an agriculture project or a policy project or a scientific project might have. And, you know, we are at a moment in which we have to throw everything we've got at the wall and see what sticks in relation to environmental justice, balance, and the climate crisis. And so why not try that too? And then there's another kind of little piece which has to do with deep time, with relationship between art and deep time. It definitely contributes to this sort of notion of fostering these potential non-monocultural versions of an imagination of the deep future. But it also very clearly, if you go and you look back at the record, the arts in the kind of widest possible sense, including ritual, including poetry, including oral traditions, and so on, the arts hold some of the deepest memories and knowledges that we've ever accumulated as a species around our interconnection to more than human species, our relationship with the planet, our responsibilities towards plants. I mean, these were encoded on this incredibly resilient technology that was art. And so to think about art in relation to deep time, forward and backwards, and in a circular sense in all directions is, I think, a really useful way of also looking at its potentials. So my work then is about trying to find the organizational structures, the institutional, but also networked contexts that can support these different kinds of agency by being as adherent as possible to the necessities of the project themselves. And so to mention just two, general ecology that you opened with was an attempt to prototype a kind of, I suppose, code hack of an art institution to try and see whether it would be possible to, via the mediums of agency that were available to me at the time in 2018 when we funded the project, to influence the kind of sense of purpose of an art organization with a responsibility towards the planetary by making certain kinds of structural changes, such as the establishment of the General Ecology Department. And out of that, a few years later, emerges Back to Earth, which is a very large-scale and multi-year initiative in which we invited 65 artists to propose artworks that are also simultaneously an environmental campaign prototype, initiative, or intervention. And again, the work there is not to sort of take this piece and put it in the box that is the art organization, but to actually work on how we transform the art organization to be as adherent as possible to each one of those projects. So who do we need to bring in? What kind of knowledge systems? What is success? Where is success for each one of these initiatives? And I just wanted to close by saying I don't want to be misunderstood as someone who's arguing that art should always have a function. I do not think that there are absolutely fundamentally important artworks that do not have an immediate and stated function. I would only argue that that not immediate and stated function is actually part of the imagination work. And so that therefore, in some sense, the persistence of the artistic throughout all cultures and throughout all time has to mean something. And that's kind of the work that we're doing right now. Thank you.
Oh, wow. Brilliant. It's incredibly... It's an incredible amount of information that you managed to get into that your very brutally allocated 5 minutes. I have lots of follow-up questions, which is great. And I think you've answered the former comment also really effectively and succinctly. We're going to move on to Sanna, Vice Chair of Mustarinda. And Mustarinda has come up in many of these pre-conversations to this seminar, has a lot of admirers across a number of different panelists and across borders. What is Mustarinda, Sanna?
Okay, thank you for inviting us here. So, Mustarinda Association is a group of artists and researchers whose goal is to promote the ecological rebuilding of society, the diversity of culture and nature, and the connection between art and science. At the center of our activity lie contemporary art, boundary-crossing research, practical experimentation, communication, education, and events. If I could have the pictures, are they shown? Yes. The Mustarinda Association reaches towards the post-fossil culture by combining scientific knowledge and experiential artistic activity. Our main actions are rooted in Mustarinda House on top of Paljakanvaara Hill, Hyrynsalmi, Kainuu, Finland. The second photo. The house is surrounded by a rare old-growth forest with its pluri-species inhabitants, even though we are active both internationally and nationally too. Photo. In Mustarinda House, we run a residency where approximately 30 to 40 artists, researchers, cultural workers, activists, other professionals, and students gather yearly to work on their projects and share their knowledge and time. In addition, we have 20 to 30 volunteers, interns, and active members working for the house yearly. Outside, the work of Mustarinda might mainly show the technical solutions that have been implemented and tried out in the house during the years. Photo. Here is, for example, a graph of the current energy system of the house, which runs mainly with solar energy. It keeps our geothermal pump and heat going on, which is helped with a wood boiler in the coldest winter times. The system includes backup batteries in case of electrical blackouts and charges our electrical car. For understanding and experimenting the food processes, we have also a garden where we have tried growing different sorts of edibles in short northern Finnish summer. The garden gets its fuel from our composts and compost toilet, which have been set up for increasing the circulation of nutrition in the house. We forage and preserve the goods from the garden and from the surrounding forest. There are also some plants grown for natural pigments and dyes for artistic purposes. The previous examples are some very practical and site-specific experiments we have implemented during the past 11 years of our existence. But because we acknowledge that issues like the environmental crisis we are dealing with right now are not soluble only by setting up Mustarinda houses all around the world, we have also tried to create and normalize ways of working that are easier to take into action for anyone or any institution, like supporting slower and more ecological traveling methods instead of flying, organizing shared rides and scheduling our guests' arrivals so they can be driven to the house with the same car ride, serving vegan and as locally produced food as possible in our events, recycling our waste, and the list just goes on. During the past years, some 400 people altogether have brought knowledge from Mustarinda to the outer world that has been incubated in the house during the residencies, not to mention those who come to visit the house and the nature path and take something with them during their visit. I could say that the most beautiful and important aspects of Mustarinda is the collective knowledge building, transmission, and learning. And the effects of Mustarinda goes beyond the practical solutions and actions too. The surroundings where the house is located lets people to slow down, observe, and focus on other things than consuming. We only go grocery shopping once a week, which with the shared ride, of course. During the residency, we also aim to encourage our residents to take part in the maintenance of the house, the environment, and each other, to share the care work. Sometimes the time in the residency may also raise feelings like powerlessness or environmental anxiety, and for dealing with such feelings, we aim to create a safer and softer environment to face them. We see all of this as the practice to embody the complex concepts of practicing ecological rebuilding or reaching towards the post-fossil futures. Can I have the next photo? Mustarinda has been thanked for not making these pursuits look easy or saying that it's all a piece of cake, because it's not. We are dealing with huge and serious issues. And the last photo. And to get through them, we have to work together and take care of each other. I have shared and will share with you the whole list of actions we have collected, which you can start thinking and implementing in your own practice, organization, or institution. And just want to remind you that once more that this is super hard and this is difficult and it might seem impossible, but none of us should be doing this alone. Thank you for your time.
Beautifully put. Thank you very much for that. And like you said, this list of of what organizations can do will be published at the end. And what I really love about this is that it's such a practical list. And it's also directed at art organizations. So it completely circumvents the issue of instrumentalizing art, but talks more about what the institutions of art can do from a micro level to have macro level impact. Okay, our final panelist on this brilliant panel showing the way is Malin Lobel. Malin, you have a work or parts of a work in the exhibition in Malmö, Four Sisters of the Planthropocene. What is that?
Yes, thank you. I will have my slide immediately, I think, John. In this very short presentation, I will use the ongoing project on Malmö Art Museum, Four Sisters of the Planthropocene, as a starting point and an example of my practice and methods of working with human-plant relations. Four Sisters is also a collaboration with Janna Holmstedt as part of the biomass. So the title takes its starting point from the classical companion planting called Three Sisters, corn, beans, and squash, that in different ways support each other. Next. Robin Wall Kimmerer writes about them in her book Braiding Sweetgrass. She's also mentioning that maybe we could talk about the fourth sister, us, the humans, and that I think is very important today. How can we be supporting the ecosystem we are a part of, not just taken from it, but putting back? How can we be the fourth sister? Next, please. Our work is relational and process-oriented. This means that the work is dynamic, in constant becoming, rather than to see the artwork as a static object. It unfolds through a series of events over time. And in the poster at the right corner, we'll show the process following the season activities and programs, starting with the gift inside the Malmö Museum here, followed by the soil feast. The School of Plants now on Sunday actually will be planted out in the garden among other supporting sisters from the agroforestry system. And in the autumn, there will be a harvest feast and at last time for rest and reflection. So we have started with a gift of seeds inside the museum, as I said, where since January, corn has been sound bathing. Science has proved that corn react and stimulates on the sound frequencies on 200 hertz. Next, please. And outside, preparing the garden installation at the museum courtyard was done following the seasonal work in the garden. During January-March, when the exhibition Sustainable Societies for the Future was opening, it's time to prune trees and bushes. So the framework for the installation was made from these. Material comes from the Malmö city. Next, please. In April, we prepared and focused on the soil, and we wanted to do this by networking and collaborate with city farmers around Malmö and collecting soil stories as part of the art and research project Humus Economicus on soil blindness and the value of dirt in urbanized landscapes. The research project would draw attention to human-soil relations and the invisible work of soils and practices of soil care. You can read more on our website there, humuseconomicus.se. Next, please. We visited urban farmers from different parts of Malmö Lund who had answering our call for a soil celebration and a soil donation for the garden at the museum. Celebrate the soil, the black gold, was also an opportunity to celebrate the urban farmer and the work they do as the fourth sister. The soil donation was brought back to the museum garden and placed like a topsoil layer. Next. In another ongoing Scandinavian collaboration, we started with the question, is it time for new land reform? To put issues on other forms of using land and future farming methods, regenerative agriculture and so on. And we have visited farmers in our 3 countries, Denmark, Sweden and Norway. Next, please. I use garden as a site to learn, act, react and connect to nature. And I have been initiating and working with community gardens like here, Bellevue Farm in Stockholm. And the garden is a site to see on what and how to learn from plants and building sustainable societies. Next, a plant has 15 to 20 senses according to Professor Stefano Mancuso, and humans have 5. To survive, you have to sense your surrounding, he says. That's what plants do. Plants solve problems on site. We're human running away. Typical human thing with a brain. Interesting to see is and learn is to see the advantages and disadvantages being human. So again, looking at the 4 sisters' role in the ecosystem. Next. Within school projects about art, food and resources, I use the supermarket to reach out to a wider audience. And next, you can see an example here. We made bee stickers to show the role of pollinators for us to have food. Next and final picture is just a very last and super quick example of art as a catalyst for change. To share a garden from 2014, where I, together with artist Anneli Wallin, worked very site-specific and participatory with the local context, schools, companies, and municipality involved. Also, this garden had different layers and themes. One was feature remediation, and as a region with huge problem with pollution and heavy metals in the ground from old industries, the introduction of plants as cleaner or polluted soil was totally new for them. We introduced the method and invited Swedish researcher Maria Greger for meeting the municipality. And now this spring, after 7 years, finally, I just got the news that the municipality started actually to using this plant method for cleaning a site. And a final little tip that we were asked to give was put your hands in the ground and connect. Thank you for me.
Brilliant, thank you very much. These presentations are so dense and so fantastic with the work that you're doing. So I'm going to try and pull the pace down a little bit to let this land with our audience. And as always, dear online audience, feel free to put your comments and your questions in the chat. There's a lot of love coming to your presentations, general compliments of how brilliant you are. So maybe you could just go back a little bit, Malin, and restate what is soil blindness?
Soil blindness, it's also something you talk about blindness, plant blindness and soil blindness, that we actually have lost connection or knowledge about soil. Example is that you call it dirt. What's dirt? And soil blindness, that we don't know about the rich life underground, and to reconnect to that and value it. Actually, we're talking about peak oil, but it's also peak soil a matter. Is that?
Yes, thank you. And then just for the idea of companion planting, because it seems such a key concept in your work, could you just give a little bit concrete examples of how these different sisters fit together?
Yeah, this classical one with the three sisters, you can say that if I describe it a little bit further, you have the corn, the maize, as the biggest sister that grows tall, and then you have the beans that need some climbing, that climbs on the maize, and then you have the little sister, the squash, that's on the ground and keep them moist. Beans is actually a very good nitrogen fixer, and the other ones need a lot of nutrition. So they help in each other to grow. And I'm also been working for several years with agroforestry, or the forest garden as a system. And there you also talk a lot about this companion planting. For example, you have comfrey that also has a very good, like a dynamic accumulator, taking up nutrition from the soil and help other plants to reach it in a way. Or, for example, nitrogen fixer like sea buckthorn we will have in the garden in Malmö is also keeping nitrogen from the air and help the other planting. So in some way helping out in the garden. And here in Malmö, or where we pick up the fourth sister, is to be a part of this ecosystem is important to point out.
And the fourth sister is the human, right?
Yeah, the fourth sister is the human.
And that concept, does it come from Braiding Sweetgrass, this brilliant book?
The Three Sisters is an old classical companion planting, but she's writing about it. And it was there I read about that she was thinking about this fourth sister. And that, for me, in this concept of the sustainable society for the future, was really a good way to deal, and also that we are the problem, that we actually stepping out of this nature system. It talks about also two different gardens, two different women's, where you have Eve and the Paradise Garden. That was so good example, that because Eve kicked out from the garden, and actually that's where our civilization separated from nature. It's a very good picture of that we have this culture nature, and that's our problem today, that we're not a part of understanding that we are part of the system.
Great. And then it's a well, Braiding Sweetgrass, I can very much recommend as a book.
Yes,
this idea of indigenous knowledge also touches on what you were saying, Lucia, about the idea of deep time, and that this deep knowledge is encoded in artifacts. Would you like to expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm slightly cautious about I'm entirely in admiration of Malin's project, so please don't take this as a direct comment immediately referring to Braiding Sweetgrass, which I agree is a phenomenal book. But given the sudden kind of rise of kind of popularity of an interest in both indigenous wisdom traditions and anthropological interpretations of those wisdom traditions, I am personally a little bit hesitant to bring those specifics up without bringing up the kind of necessary follow-up, which is that of supporting political actions around land restitutions and land stewardship and things like this, and really kind of following that directly up with the kind of call for action, only in as much as we want to obviously avoid doing with knowledge or art or wisdom the same thing that the kind of hegemonic civilization of today has done with materials, which is to mine, right? So I think from the wisdom with which, Malin, you were sort of caring for the notion of companion plant species is absolutely not included in what I mean by mining. What I mean is like Silicon Valley taking a sudden interest in sort of shamanistic practices and so on. And I think we need to be a little bit careful about that. But if we look across different traditions, including the ones that we are speaking from, we see that myth and poetry and forms of art hold a lot of knowledge. And it's just this decoding work that I find super interesting. To give you a couple of examples, I think, that are really fantastic. There are passages in the Song of Songs that, if decoded, might be speaking about human date palm fertilization, which was actually a backbone of Mesopotamian civilization for millennia and a kind of really important moment of agriculture for the human species. In other examples, we see, well, it's the obvious fact of the association between plants, harvests, goddesses, and so on. Even the emergence of the sort of practices of divinations were more often than not, and are more often than not, connected with the weather. And then, you know, fast forward to the 80s, 90s, the long-term nuclear warning signs steering group is looking for all these ways to communicate across deep time, not to dig in a particular place where nuclear waste is going to be buried. They go through all these different options, sculptures, spiky things, language, coded messages, all kinds of things. The most realistic option emerges from semioticians and anthropologists, which is to sort of generate an oral tradition. And so we make so much of the notion of technology as a kind of hardware with, you know, made of rare earth materials. Well, why don't we start looking at art as actually one of the most resilient technologies that we have ever come up with as a species, for example?
Beautiful. And bringing it down from the divine, if you like, and into the hard practicalities of institutional change. You had quite a neat sort of list about how to begin to create institutional change in our previous conversation. Would you mind running through that for our online audience?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I can tell you the story of how the General Ecology went about its business, which was at the time I was curator of public programs at the Serpentine. And so I decided to start from the point of, you know, immediate agency. What's the agency that I have tomorrow to do something? And that point was programming the conditions were quite ripe. I have budgets that stretch over the whole year, which means that I can be quite flexible where the budget goes in terms of programming how the year goes, and quite a lot of autonomy in terms of programming public programs that relate to the exhibitions program, but there was also always a kind of expectation of discursive independence. And so in 2018, we started to program obsessively around environmental questions. And what happens when you do that is that you start to develop a community of audience and interlocutors and also kind of collaborators who mirror back at the institution an image of itself as one that has actually taken a step into the environmental field. And then what you're doing there is you bring back that image inside and you try and make the case for, well, in order to be true to this, to what is believed about this now, of what we're talking about and what we're kind of stepping into, then there's all this work that we need to do internally, how we work together, how we relate to our own carbon footprint, all this stuff. That's the kind of slow, difficult, invisible work. And it's definitely not, we're not at the place where I can kind of stand here and go like, we've solved it all. It's really slow, really meticulous. And in fact, Sanna's fantastic list is such a, brilliant kind of companion to the kind of work that needs to be done internally to an organization. And then now we're kind of moving into the place of looking at the network that was generated as a result of this network of actors and agents and sort of individuals and organizations who might all have an investment in the environmental field, but not necessarily in the arts or vice versa. And we're starting to develop a slightly more formal network in which we kind of facilitate the possibilities for cross-pollinations between those, so that it's not just 700 one-way, one-to-one relationships, but we actually start to weave that a little bit and make some concrete plans in terms of working groups that are going to be working towards very specific things. For example, one of the things that we want to work on is, on the one hand, develop a curriculum that sort of would form a generation of people who might be interested in systems change and ecology and going into institutions and kind of tweaking the possible parameters of it. And then on the other hand, really looking at sort of how do we assess our impact? Can we recode the way in which we assess our impact to include some kind of planetary responsibility towards environmental justice and balance, things like this. So, long-term work, I suppose.
Yeah, super interesting. And also this idea that perhaps the public-facing arm of the institution, if you like, can hasten the internal work that needs to be done.
I think it's really important to say that, because words tend to, they paint big brush strokes on things, and I'm always quite cautious. So this idea of greenwashing, for example, is quite obvious when you're talking about British Petroleum. But when you're talking about an institution whose kind of business it is to be on the discursive and imagination end of the spectrum, then can you imagine some kind of agency-filled interim tiny moment of intermittent quote-unquote greenwashing in order to get to the place where you want to get to, right? Like, so how can we be, I'm a big fan of the word, of recuperating the word manipulation, because ultimately sculpture is manipulation. So I think that we need to be very nuanced and complex as we're dealing with these issues. But yes, absolutely, from the out to the in and back again.
Yeah, beautiful. There's a question for you, Lucia, from Niels Petter Flint on Facebook. Art is a new technology, super cool. Please describe more. Which I can imagine would take an entire 2-hour talk, but maybe describe it succinctly.
I think it probably would. I kind of use the word technology provocatively, mostly because the first time I had an occasion to sort of put this hypothesis out to a public was in the context of a tech conference, and I was kind of met with a lot of like, whatever sort of situation. I think it requires a slightly expanded and imaginative understanding of both the word technology and the word art and all of this. But just, if we imagine memory palaces, techniques, memory palaces oral histories, mythologies, religions, spiritualities as techniques towards memory, then we can imagine, then we can do away with the hardware part and sort of imagine it as a kind of software. I mean, it's also a game to sort of map technological discourse onto what is essentially anthropological discourse, I suppose. But yeah, I had another thought in relation to that, but it'll come back.
Well, give me a little holler when you do. And we'll move to a question from Apollonia again to Malin. Great work, Malin and Jana and the four sisters. What does it mean for your work when presented in an art museum, as most of it happens elsewhere? Can you say more about the museum display?
Okay. Yeah, I think now we're working like a way that it's starting inside the museum and this being in the process, and now it's outside in the courtyard as well. I actually, yeah, as Apollonia says, I have actually mostly, and I think that's important as well, to work outside of the institution. And this is an attempt, I think, from the Malmö Museum, like a try. It's the invitation was actually that we should work in the long term, and that this is a try. I think that we discuss how can we work in these kind of ways. I think maybe Kirse, if she's here somewhere, also can be in the comment. Yeah, sorry, it was not a good answer.
Not at all. Also messing with my system, bringing more people into the conversation,
yeah,
which is
great.
But I think, well, you did go through the slides of what is currently on display in the museum.
Yeah.
Is there an opportunity, perhaps, we have very little time, but just to go back to those images, because I think with the sheer speed of how one had to go through them, maybe particularly that thing about the sonic dimension and the effect that it has on seeds might be worth just going back to and dwelling on.
Yeah, I can say how we worked actually was this, being invited to an exhibition working with a garden in wintertime was also a way that we took into what can you do, what's happening in January. It's not even time to plant the seeds. But this with the sunbathing, and Jana, my colleague, she's working with sound as a sound artist and also been working with the corn before. So this with having them prepared so they stimulate growing, that is easier for them to grow when it's time to put them in the seeds in April. So this, and it's actually Monica Gagliano as a scientist that you can see that especially corn reacts on these around 200 hertz. So that was a way to, yeah, this we can do and this we can show and put on focus on in wintertime. At the same time, this preparing the garden in the yard was also to taking care of resources, to use these cut branches and trees from Malmö city. To make the frame for the garden. And then following the season, that in April we have to prepare the soil. Actually, the exhibition Sustainable Societies ends now on the 23rd, and then the Four Sisters for Plantrocene will be ready, or I mean, everything will be planted and science and stuff. Actually, we will move out the house from the museum and place it on the courtyard. So this is a project that's a part of Sustainable Societies for the Future, but also has its own project running the whole season until the end of October at least. And then we see what's happening with the garden.
No, that's great. Thank you. It's nice the way that this exhibition has sort of temporal tentacles that supersede the actual space of the museum. Yes.
I can comment just shortly again, this also to reach out, because I think working inside the institution, for me, it's very important to have these tentacles out to the city, especially working with these issues about environmental issues and climate issues or sustainability in that way. So this actually it was due to the pandemic situation that we couldn't have a public event on the garden, on the courtyard at the museum with the Soil Fest. So that was a solution to go outside, and that I think was very good for us, or give more meaning, and also this to to highlight or put focus on all these farmers around in Malmö city. Answer to the one that asked question for Mary Mattingly. It's a lot of actually good community gardens or also commercial local food producers in Malmö, better than in Stockholm, where I'm actually also practicing.
Oh, good. Thank you for answering the question that came up earlier. That's great. And we are running out of time, but I wanted to just bring in Sanna and Mustarinda briefly, because you mentioned the residency, but I understand that there's also a deadline for applying for the residency for the people who might be watching and want to come and join you in your great work.
Yes, we do have, unfortunately, due to COVID, it's now only for people residing in Finland. But if there is someone watching this who might suit in this description, you're welcome to apply, and we are eagerly waiting that the situation will turn into better. So it would be, again, possible to invite people coming from abroad also, because we are voluntarily working group, so the amount of work that the cancellation and rescheduling because of the COVID would grow in such a huge amount, we have decided to limit it now only.
Yeah, fully understandable.
Of Finland.
Thank you very much. And unfortunately, we have to leave it there. I mean, absolutely fascinating panel, and I would have loved to speak to you longer. But it remains for me to thank you, Malin, Lucia, and Sanna. Thank you so much for your thoughtful comments and your presentations.
Thank you.
Moving on to the final panel, which is entitled New Terms of Growing. This is our final panel of the day, and it features Karen Gamborg Knudsen and Kasper Magnussen from the artist duo Gamborg and Magnussen. Sean Raspet, who is an artist based now in New York, who's often working with liquid chemical formulations, and who is co-founder of the algae-based food company Non-Food, and Stephanie Costello, who was mentioned earlier, a writer and curator based in Chicago and an art advisor to Expo Chicago, among many, many other things. So Karen and Kasper, will delve straight in and start with you. You have an iteration of your ongoing work with cabbage in Chicago. Now, what is this?
Hi, can you hear us? Good. Thank you. We are very grateful for the invitation. We are an artist duo. We're interested in objects from teapots to landscapes. By juxtaposing and re-relating them, we might make new meaning. We see our role as artists not to give answers, but rather to look at things, make images, space, forms, and poetic experiences. We put objects in the center and let discussions orbit around them. The onlooker has to come up with their own answers or questions. We want to keep things open. We are not social workers or farmers, but cultivators of perception beyond moral behavior. We create meaning together and together with you. Interior and exterior transformation. We want things to transcend. In 2019, we made a project, The Cabbage Patch, representing Denmark at the Chicago Architecture Biennial. It was a cabbage field consisting of 12,000 cabbage heads and a social sculpture, a kitchen. Seeing the cabbage field as an object relating to a city, foregrounding an architectural biennial and a botanical garden, in this case situated in a socially challenged area in Garfield Park, Chicago, might pose questions about land use, food scarcity, monoculture, and agriculture. And beauty. The field and the kitchen was a meeting point for social projects like community gardens in the neighborhood, social kitchens, and teaching programs for school kids, elder people, and just visitors. Pick a cabbage, fry it, stir it, study it, or bring it home. Agriculture is an object that is difficult to fully grasp. We might only understand wounds, traces, or shadows from it, like pesticides in the groundwater or the beauty of the sunset over the fields. Agriculture is something close to us. We are surrounded by it everywhere, but it's still somehow overlooked. We are looking at the overlooked, the ordinary, and the extraordinary. Cabbage is beautiful. It's an object that we all have a relation to. It's considered poor man's friend, Freund der Armen. It's compact, easy to stack, and full of vitamins. The hallway smelled of boiled cabbage and old rag mats. In the arts, 16th century still life paintings have lifted the poor vegetable into the sublime, and maybe it only caught the interest of the painter because of its mere beauty. Look how the surface reflects the light, just like our skin does, layer by layer, tight and wrinkled. By looking at the ordinary and the overlooked and constantly asking about its meaning and creating methods to discuss it, we can shift the meaning and perhaps find the beauty and maybe touch people. Sustainability is to carry common objects into the future, and every object has a potential to change. Thank you.
Thank you for that beautiful lecture performance. We will come back to questions for you and to remind our online audience that questions for our panelists can be posed in the chat on YouTube and Facebook. But now I would like to move on to Sean to tell us a little bit about your work. And I understand you have work both in the sort of Malmö section of this exhibition and in the Chicago section. I look forward to hearing about your work.
Unmute myself. Hi, can everyone hear me? Okay, great. So yes, so I've been recently, well, really the last 3 years or so, been working a lot with plants and their genetics, and specifically with inducing mutations in plant varieties, especially a lot of native plant varieties, not necessarily commonly cultivated varieties, and essentially increasing the biodiversity or genetic diversity within a kind of group of organisms. And part of the long-term, this image, by the way, is some genetically altered morning glories that have been exposed to radiation. This is actually an earlier kind of work where it was in collaboration with a institution in Japan called the Institute for Radiation Breeding. So this is not something that I developed, but rather something they developed, which I planted. But the long-term kind of goal or thesis that I'm kind of testing is that through kind of increasing the genetic diversity within a kind of population, it can potentially allow those organisms to more quickly adapt to rapidly changing climate conditions. So that's kind of something that we're seeing around the world through different biomes and ecosystems that, as ecosystems that have developed to optimize themselves within a certain range of temperatures and humidity, as that quickly changes, which it's already starting to do and most likely will accelerate, there's kind of an upheaval in the species composition, in the ability of the certain species to be able to adapt and continue within that ecosystem. And so this is kind of at this point on a small scale, something that this project is kind of testing and trying to address. And I should say, from another perspective, I find it interesting. I find it interesting to just create more variety in the world and to try to realize possibilities that otherwise might not occur. Theoretically, through regular evolution, all these variations that have come through this project will eventually exist, or could eventually exist, but this is just kind of a way of speeding up evolution, essentially. And yeah, that's pretty much the main project that I've been working on.
Great. And how, just briefly, this non-food?
Oh yes. Mm-hmm. So non-food is it's an algae-based food company. I co-founded it in 2016. It was kind of seen as an extension of my art practice, but more importantly, a functional company and something that's scalable, with the goal of basically creating foods out of algae. The reason for focusing on algae is that it has a resource footprint that is even much lower than plant-based foods, and it's has a very good nutritional profile. Has more protein than meat, which protein is often the limiting factor in kind of global food supply. So it has a lot of potential, but I didn't see any companies or really serious endeavors to to kind of scale that as a product, to kind of make a large scale kind of impact, I guess, on what people are eating. And so, yeah, the company was founded with that goal.
That's super interesting. There's a Mustarinda who we just heard have an annual lichen fest. It feels like there's dovetailing between your respective projects. But we'll get back to concrete questions about that. But let me bring in Stephanie, who was also involved in the earlier symposium, Museums as Catalysts for Change. You're back with your brilliance, and to tell us perhaps about the book that you've been working on for Sustainable Societies for the Future.
Yes, and it's great to be here with an artist duo and also an artist that we've been able to collaborate with through various projects in Chicago since before Sustainable Societies for the Future as well. So it's nice to see familiar faces and the continuation of the projects. But yeah, so I was one of the curators for the Sustainable Societies for the Future exhibition. We were able to, because of this, bring in a large contingent of artists from the United States, but specifically from Chicago and the region. Sean, just having recently moved to New York, was previously based in Detroit, which we have such a close relationship with because of proximity. So we're going to be bringing portions of the exhibition to Chicago, but I think what is really important and one of the new sort of methodologies of working that has been discovered through working on this exhibition and as an editor for the publication that accompanied the show, but is not a formal catalog for the show, sort of an extension of the exhibition in print, is that, with the pandemic and with borders being closed and not being able to travel between, doing an exhibition across seas that takes place in two localities was obviously presenting a number of challenges that I don't think any of us could have anticipated before. But in one of the ways that we were able to navigate that shift in how we work, also, I think we discovered more sustainable ways to install exhibitions in the future that don't require as much travel and really rely on collaboration and trust and figuring out ways to make things work when your physical body can't travel. How can you bring a show to other audiences. And so one of the ways that Kirsa and the whole team at the Malmö Art Museum that we approached this was through an accompanying publication. And I just wanted to share the approach that we took for this book, from the sort of inception of it to also alter it to become more of an exhibition in print in itself. So I'll share, a few of the, anyway, I'm sure that everybody can see my screen, but I'm going to zoom out here. So basically the exhibition took as its starting point these 11 tenets from the UN Goal 11, which was 11 ways that the arts could reach a more sustainable footprint by the year 2030. And these were environmental justice, global climate, biodiversity. It sort of, goes along this thematic over the 11 goals. And what we worked on with a designer based in Paris through the Berlin publisher Modo was to come up with a series of glyphs that could represent all of these goals, so resources, pollution, biodiversity. And in the actual index of the book, where we have 6 texts, some of them are written by artists in the exhibition, like Mustarinda, who just spoke, has a manifesto in the book. So it's sort of a companion piece to the work in the show, was to have these glyphs serve as an undercurrent of what thematics were covered in the various texts, because all of these things are interconnected to reach sort of a sustainable moment. And it goes into social issues as well of gender equality, racial equity, health and safety. All of these goals from the UN Goal 11 were really heightened during the pandemic. These ongoing issues that we saw in maybe not such a direct way, we knew that they were there, were really brought to the fore when things were locked down and the inequality and the structural issues surrounding our society became unignorable on a global stage. And so what we were able to do was to create this publication, and I'll just show a few images of it. This is what it ended up looking like. So all of the glyphs sort of, held within this publication, and the dust jacket and the cover is actually a companion piece of the brand of the exhibition. So anybody who buys the book can also have a piece of the show and a piece of these goals with them. And then within the publication, in terms of actual actionable change, like the manifesto by Mustarinda have concrete goals of what organizations, art or otherwise, can do better to enact this change, from staff travel to energy uses to hopefully getting towards some type of carbon neutral footprint, how those steps can take place. And it's, the manifesto itself is a list of suggestions that is not exhaustive, but really in depth. And I think one of the strengths of the publication and the exhibition and the artists in the exhibition is that all of these suggestions are just ideas and new ways of thinking that encourage other organizations and individuals to look at what their resources are and what they can implement, and if they have any further ideas. So it really just sparks the conversation about what we can do and how we can do it. One other thing I'll say on the topic of sustainability is that I think we also learned a lot in terms of what it means to have a sustainable labor effort to design these exhibitions. The art world sort of is propped upon an exploitative labor system where artists and curators and scholars and thinkers do often a lot of work for free. And outside of an exchange of capital, it's also the mental capacity to be working on multiple exhibitions in different time zones at the same time. And so I think through the collaboration and the necessary trust of not being able to be where you need to be physically, allowed for a much more sustainable way of working that subsists on collaboration, which I hope is partially brought over into a post-pandemic world, that you don't have to travel all over the globe for a single day to do an installation, although that would have made certain things easier for the show itself, that it's possible to have a broader way of thinking that can lead to larger and more expansive exhibitions that still have ambition but don't necessarily have such a huge ecological and labor footprint on the protagonists involved.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because we do often talk about, when we talk about sustainability, sort of not exhausting natural resources and our immediate environment, but the idea of exhausting human resources is obviously a very important part of this, from big museums, 0-hour contracts to the kinds of exhaustion that you're describing of the cultural worker, the globe-trotting cultural worker. Yeah. I wanted to follow up with, you've answered some of it, that you've found sustainable ways to install in the future. And obviously you mentioned trust as key, but are there any other, maybe also following up from Mustarinda's very concrete advice, is there anything else that stands out for you in this sort of pandemic approach to installing an exhibition, which you hope will be repeated in the future?
Yeah, I think one of the greatest takeaways from the Sustainable Societies for the Future, but I also have worked on 3 other exhibitions that were overseas during the length of the pandemic, is the flexibility of how the content can take form. And we're very lucky and fortunate that a lot of the artists in the Sustainable Societies for the Future exhibition, above all, are conceptual artists. So when parameters are put into place, either limited to a single shipping container, from a very logistic standpoint, to have a single shipping container go over instead of sending 8 massive sculptures that would have needed their individual crates from the inception of a proposal that happened before this global pandemic. It was beautiful to talk through with the artists and for me to be able to be in their studios to re-envision what an exhibition looks like of the same work when that is no longer possible, when they're not able to go and install. Sean had some really brilliant new ways of working, and I'm sure would have loved to actually be there or to have grown the seeds before the installation. Shipping seeds and the equipment needed to grow them was possible. For other artists, it was taking, like for the floating museum, for example, it was taking these large sort of monumental sculptures and translating them into the form of a series of valises. So these like very small, intimate environments that when the suitcase is opened up, you enter into it, but it's not filling the entire room. So, you know, these translations, I think more than anything, it's an issue of translation, and that's where the work and working with artists allows flexibility, especially in the conceptual environment that the artists that we selected were working with.
And since you mentioned Sean's work, maybe we can turn to you, Sean. Are there some kind of experiences of this particular way of working that you would like to bring with you as we move forward?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, actually, I mean, definitely, you know, it is something that I consider, you know, when either producing work or shipping work is, you know, the kind of emissions, you know, that result from that. And so, yeah, definitely shipping, you know, perhaps 5 grams of seeds, you know, was, you know, obviously has a quite low carbon footprint versus, you know, shipping the plants themselves, which, you know, would be slightly more in terms of weight, but, you know, a larger package size, which factors into it as well. So, yeah, I thought, you know, that was definitely a kind of an ideal, really, way of being able to present that work. And yeah, I think, I mean, typically with my works, I try to go small if I can, you know, or to have something, I mean, having something that grows from small to big and can stay in the same location is always great. And yeah, we were able to, I believe, source the growing kind of containers locally, you know, just through, or at least within, you know, Europe. So that was good too. So yeah, but yeah, I plan to continue to kind of to do that, you know, as much as possible for sure.
Yeah, it is almost like you have to relinquish some form of control and invoke one of these, the one Marley mentioned, another 4th sister of the Planthropocene to act as custodian of your work.
That's true, yeah.
And I think one thing that connects the 2 artists' work that we're talking with on this panel is not that emissions don't exist, but that the emissions become, through the growing of plants, carbon neutral. And ideally carbon negative. And that was one thing that I was looking into with my work at Expo Chicago as well. There's various gallery climate coalitions now that understand that the shipping of work and the structure in which we make exhibitions exists for a reason, because large exhibitions happen at museums and galleries all the time. But the question then becomes, how can you limit the impact, not through the show itself, but through what you're able to do to counteract the emissions that are necessary to make. And that is a field that's sort of growing, and a coalition that's growing globally in commercial gallery sectors, as well as through museums of, you know, it could be as simple as you measure the carbon footprint of the shipment and pay to plant as many trees to offset that in a certain environment. So there's all sorts of ways that things can come to an even balance, or potentially zero, with some effort and creative thinking.
Yeah, I mean, one thing just real quick is, I mean, I think you could think of, or maybe from a, either institution perspective, you can think of, you know, plants as kind of sculptures that are fabricated out of carbon that is then being removed from the atmosphere, you know, and then the other advantage is that they can continue to grow and continue to kind of sequester carbon. And I mean, I think also, you know, it would be interesting to, I mean, I don't necessarily think this is going to happen, but if one of the outcomes of maybe the pandemic and everything, and rethinking kind of how exhibitions can happen, is that maybe the time frame changes. You know, like maybe if the plants were growing, you know, for years and years before the actual exhibition opens, you know, that would be you know, an interesting thing. Or if, yeah, just rethinking. I mean, because I think that in addition to all the other structures that are in place in the kind of art system that mirror the overall economy and cause all this resource consumption. One of the things is time, the pace of exhibitions, and an old exhibition has to be cleared out for a new one to come in. It has to come from a remote place typically. But if we were able to kind of think of both the location and the kind of timing and pace of the exhibitions differently, I think it could have a lot of benefit, not just for carbon emissions, but just for perhaps rethinking, other things in day-to-day life as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And just, we are running out of time, which is interesting, and talking about time frames and the urgency of having things set to particular time frames. But briefly, Gamborg and Magnussen, is there anything from this particular process, this particular project, that you would like to bring into how you continue to work?
Yes.
Great. What?
I think that's. I think there's loads of things, and I think if you're asking for a specific thing that's for me difficult to think, I think like how we also said in our small presentation is that when we start a project like this, we don't really know the outcome of it. We look at it. We look at this thing, this piece of agriculture and this field, and we see what it can do and what discussions starts to orbit around that. And now we sit here with that project, and we are speaking, we are in a part of a seminar that is speaking about things now, sustainability and things like that. So already that, I think, again, it points in so many directions, and I think we are ready to pick up a lot of them. And this is how we work. Like things are continuing, and that's also, I think, sustainability is maybe also that, a way of thinking, a way of working, that things are, you build maybe a foundation that new things can grow on, new things can develop from. So there's also a future from this thing we're speaking about. Maybe yeah. I cannot be more.
I think that's a really nice way of, you had some really beautiful phrases in your presentation as well, like being that artists are cultural agents of perception, and the slogan "Cabbage is beautiful," which I'm certainly ready to put on a bumper sticker. Unfortunately, we are, as ever, running out of time, so I have to round off this super interesting panel, but also the super interesting seminar. And of course, it has given so much food for thought. And I must also thank our online audience for engaging so heavily, and in many cases also somewhat provocatively, which is always good, because then you really get to the nitty-gritty of things much quicker. There isn't time for me to sum up, but there are certain things, and it's impossible to do anyway. But I think this idea of the catalyst, again, which I've said before, as something that provokes or speeds up significant change, is something that maybe does capture the role of art in this striving for a more sustainable society. There are various very concrete pieces of advice that we can take with us. There's also this idea of collaboration and interdisciplinarity as being crucial for how we move forward. The concept of time as not necessarily being the one that is peddled or perpetuated by the art world, but a much more of a deep time, and a sense of how one might want to have to work differently to avoid exhaustion or working in an unsustainable fashion. Jan Vår started out our seminar today by stating that the role of art is to question our value system. And then several of you have been in this, picking up on this kind of idea that the role of art is to question and uncover deeper questions, and that art can hold deep knowledge and we need to listen to plants. So there are so many things that we can take with us, and I hope that our audience will also revisit this talk and visit the artist's website, the project websites connected to this, and to do whatever they can in their own lives and their own professional capacities. I would like to thank all our panelists and Malmö Art Museum and Expo Chicago and Nordic Art Talks, and leave you all with Ingela Erman's film, The Queen of the Night, which is 3 minutes and 38 seconds long. And enjoy the rest of your day/evening wherever you are. Stay safe. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.